overview talk is intended to give you just a flavor of what the rest of the day will cover, and you're also, especially the folks online, that may be as much as you want, and that's okay. So you're free to dial out after this first talk. I want to acknowledge our sponsors. The Climate Impacts Research Consortium is a NOAA-funded regional enterprise focused on connecting science with natural resource management in the Northwest. And it was a poll or a careful mail survey by CIRC that sort of pointed to the need for this project. And then the Northwest Climate Science Center stepped forward with major funding, adding to what we already had through CIRC. And also sort of tangentially, John Abasaglu and I are funded under the REACH project, and that's also supported a little bit of David Roop's time on the climate stuff. I also want to acknowledge C3. I guess I should have put your logo on here too. David Pott, sitting in the back with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has been gracious enough to arrange for C3, the Climate Change Collaborative, to provide the WebEx broadcasting so that we can reach a wider audience than just those of you fortunate enough to sit in this room with the fine pastries and coffee. So the motivation of this project was the recognition that in many natural resource management communities that climate change was an important factor that needed to be incorporated in future planning, but that there was a lack of information about what that climate change would look like. The survey that I mentioned with CIRC pointed to the top priority items were water availability, snow cover, and flooding. Also temperature and precipitation, and changes in vegetation. So this spoke to the need to do a next generation effort at understanding climate change, but also to run hydrologic and vegetation models. So the objectives of this project were to describe the future climate, hydrology, and vegetation. Now there are very, very fancy, complicated coupled models that could be run, but our feeling was that what we would rather do is independently produce the best available science for the hydrology and the vegetation, because if you talk to a hydrologer, they'll say the hydrology and a vegetation model isn't very good, and if you talk to a vegetation modeler, they'll say that the vegetation and a hydrology model isn't very good. So we figured we'd use the two types of models to maximum strength, but coordinate the selection and application of the climate scenarios. We also wanted to pay attention to characterizing uncertainties, because a lot of our decision makers, which include a lot of you folks, recognize that there isn't just one number. It's not like, you know, if you're not asking the question, exactly how much will temperature change by 2050, and if we tell you 2.2 degrees Celsius, you go away happy. You recognize that there's a range of uncertainty, and so we needed to characterize that as well as possible. We also recognize that we need to satisfy multiple audiences. Everything from a very simple and in some cases qualitative description to people maybe more in the research end who want all of the digital data that are available, terabytes of data to input. How this work differs from previous efforts: we have a new generation of climate models, the CMIP-5, which David Roop and I will say a little bit more about later. More attention here to model evaluation, looking at how the models performed in the 20th century against observations. More attention to quantifying uncertainty, and improved and updated hydrologic and vegetation models, and also the driving data for those. And as I mentioned, the coordinated use of climate scenarios between the hydrology and vegetation modeling. Now, just a couple of words about the assumptions that we researchers and many other folks make. You know, there are still some people who think there is one answer. Modelers make an assumption, and this may be a well-founded assumption, that a model that performed well in the past will do well in the future when we radically change the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We don't know this to be true, and we won't know this to be true until the future is the past, but we operate on that assumption, and that's one reason we do model evaluation. Another assumption that we work with is that when we're trying to quantify uncertainty, the different modeling groups that have created different climate models or different hydrology models or different vegetation models have made numerical choices that in some sense reflect the true uncertainty of the system, so that the outcomes of the modeling, the range of outcomes, can be taken as a proxy for the uncertainty inherent in the system. That may not be a valid assumption, but it is a common assumption, and it's the most convenient way to characterize uncertainty. There's a separate project that we're involved with to characterize uncertainty in a more deliberate and careful way, but it's not ready for prime time yet. So, overview of tasks. We did climate model evaluation that was published. I'll just very briefly mention that. The MACA downscaling. MACA stands for Multivariate Adaptive Constructed Analogs. Regional climate modeling. This is still in progress. We selected the GCMs, the global climate models, to use as inputs. The hydrologic modeling is intended to use 2 hydrologic models. You'll see results from the first one, the VIC model. The Unified Land Model will follow later. Vegetation modeling, MC2, which is MAPS Century version 2, and the 3PG, which is, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's in your handout, the 4-page handout. It's physiological something, something, something. And then for the domains, we were funded just to do the Pacific Northwest, but there was so much interest, especially among other CSCs, that John did the MACA downscaling for the whole continental U.S., and the vegetation and hydrologic modeling has been done, I believe, west of 105 degrees longitude. The climate scenarios, the CMIP-5 I mentioned. CMIP stands for the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. They've done, they've coordinated model simulations from about 20 modeling groups around the world, including some countries that didn't previously have much of a climate modeling effort. There were 41 models that simulated the 20th century. These are full ocean atmosphere models, so they produce El Nino events whenever, and they don't correspond with exactly the unfolding of climate as observed, but it was forced by the same greenhouse gases and solar variations and so on that were observed. So it is comparable to the 20th century. We use that for our model evaluation. There are about 25 models that have done 21st century simulations, and these were available starting in 2011. So we did regional evaluation, and we recommend the sort of top tier. You'll see the ranking shortly, the MACA downscaling, and we also did a comparison with CMIP-3, the previous generation, which I won't say much about. So the inputs for these climate models begin by spinning out a variety of ideas about how carbon dioxide will unfold in the future, what are called the representative concentration pathways. And this chart shows the various scenarios. RCP 8.5 is a world in which the radiative forcing, or the additional energy input to the system from greenhouse gases, is 8.5 watts per square meter relative to a pre-industrial value. And then the other numbers, 6, 4.5, and 3PD is also known as 2.6. I won't go into reasons why. Achieving the 2.6 scenario would require that over the next 30 or so years, we dial back greenhouse gas emissions just as quickly as we've dialed them up. So they've sort of gone like this, and we'd have to go like that. So that is virtually impossible. It's a nice idea. But for these purposes, we've taken RCP 4.5, the green curve, as the lower end of our projections, and RCP 8.5 is the upper end. So we're focusing on those 2 scenarios. With this, with the new set of scenarios, they don't stop at 2100. In fact, they continue beyond, and the RCP 8.5 eventually rises to a radiative forcing of 12 watts per square meter farther out in the 22nd, 23rd century, in case anybody cares about things that far out in the future. These are the CMIP-5 models that John has downscaled with MACA. You see the flags there representing all the different countries. I put a little asterisk next to MIROC 5 in the lower left. That is a model that we've chosen as a sort of representative model to show certain results. So you'll see some results from that. This is the model ranking from David's JGR paper. And the top models are American, French, British, Canadian, more French, Chinese, and then MIROC, the Japanese. So we provide these for sort of advisory purposes, and if you're only going to run or pay attention to a subset of the full list, you may as well start at the top. Now, one way to think about what these models say is to do a scatter plot of their projected temperature change and precipitation change. So the y-axis here is the change in annual mean temperature for 2069 to 98, as indicated on the top. And the x-axis is the change in annual precipitation. And the MIROC results are circled in yellow. The numbers correspond to the ranking. And the big plus symbols are the averages for all models in that scenario. The reds are the RCP 8.5 and the blue are RCP 4.5. So you see the circled number 12 there next to the big red plus. That's the MIROC 5 model, so it's very close to the all-model average for RCP 8.5, and it's not too far away from the all-model average for RCP 4.5. Now, for some numbers, you see a bunch of those numbers. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see a bold number 8 and a whole bunch of faint number 8s. That particular model provided more than one simulation with the same conditions, and just changing the initial conditions to get a slightly different climate. And so those are provided by some modeling groups. The ones that are in bold are the only ones that we've made available with MACA. So getting now to results, you'll see a series of plots like this later in David's talk, but the spread of results from this range of GCMs is indicated by the thick band of color. So the gray shading on the left comes from the simulations of the 20th century, and then we have the red and yellow shading for the simulations of the 21st century with those two scenarios that I mentioned, the RCP 4.5 and 8.5. The thick curve going through each one is the average of all the models, and so the all-model average is often taken as probably the best estimate of how things will unfold. This has generally proven true in the past. If you average all models together, it tends to perform better than any one model. So this would suggest that our best understanding of future climate change, as represented by those thick curves, is that the RCP 8.5 and 4.5 will diverge after the first few decades, and by the end of the century, it could be about 6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, or a little over 3 Celsius, with the RCP 4.5 scenario. That's a more sustainable world, or 11 degrees Fahrenheit for the more let's burn all the coal kind of world. Now, I meant to point out in this figure that if you look at the bottom part of the diagram with all of the numbers, all of the models that project very little temperature change, 2 Celsius and less, have high numbers. They're in the 20s. So these are models that did not perform very well for the 20th century. So if we think about a model evaluation approach, it suggests that we might actually need to raise that lower ends, because the models that did well project more warming than the models that did poorly. I also want to point out, as we go to the slide after the bands, these gray bands indicate the range of variability for 20th century climate. So the precipitation bands, precipitation projections, many of them lie within that gray band, indicating that the changes are not profound, whereas all of the temperature changes are outside the gray band on the x-axis because the temperature changes are large. So that shows up in this diagram as even the bottom end of the projections clear the x-axis. In other words, there is no scenario under which we don't get warming, if you'll pardon the double negative. That's not the case with precipitation. In fact, although the all-model average nudges precipitation up very slightly in the annual mean, there's a very wide range of projected changes across all the models. And it really doesn't matter much how much the greenhouse gases go up. It's virtually the same between 4.5 and 8.5. That's not true if you break this down seasonally. the models are fairly uniform about, although not unanimous, about projecting increases in winter precipitation and decreases in summer precipitation. And we've also shown the MIROC-5 model, which is the heavy red curve in each of these panels, and all of these have been smoothed to emphasize low frequency variability. So the time series from any model looks a little bit like observations with a lot of year-to-year variability, but we want to kind of focus on the slower manifold of changes. John's going to talk more in a few minutes about the MACA data set, but there's a nice website where you can select some plotting options, and he'll go over that a little bit later. But this is just a visual representation of MACA. The upper left is the raw output of GCMs, and it looks like the caption got clipped a little bit, but it's the same field. It's the change in the maximum summertime temperature. The bottom is the same after it's been statistically downscaled, so it has finer granularity to it. Now, global models, even statistically downscaled, are still just coarse resolution, and so one of the things that we're doing is looking at regional modeling. This is a representation of the differences between global models in the top, a regional model with a 50-kilometer resolution in the middle, and a super ensemble that we've developed using volunteers' personal computers, 140,000 simulated model years, and this is a 25-kilometer resolution at the bottom. All three fields show change in spring temperature. Sorry, the color bars are different. We didn't make the middle one. But in the top panel, there's no hint of mountains or any difference except distance from the ocean. In the middle panel, you're starting to see more warming in the mountains and a little bit less in the inner Columbia Plateau. And in the bottom, at 25-kilometer resolution, you can see springtime warming much more pronounced in the mountains than in the lowlands on each side. The upper right panel shows the simulated snow change in CMIP-5 models, and it also is an indication of the topography in the global models. They slope gradually upward to a big bump where the Rocky Mountains are, and so Idaho is this kind of knoll, a state-sized knoll, and that's where the snow disappears from. And there's no, snow or mountains in Oregon or California. So for some purposes, regional models are very helpful, and they tell us this important story that warming is enhanced in the mountains. So summary of the climate. All scenarios show warming, very wide range. Scenario emissions matter a lot after 2030 or 2040. The models with the least warming were poor performers in the past. Summer, somewhat more warming than other seasons, also drier and sunnier. And the winter, somewhat wetter and cloudier. Regional modeling say mountains warm more. For hydrology, I want to feature also, in addition to the modeling with the VIC, a sensitivity approach that Julie Vano came up with, which is a way to look at uncertainties more exhaustively. So this is a diagram of the VIC hydrologic model construction. It's a gridded model, distributed model. It simulates the fluxes of energy and water. There are subgrid cell properties of vegetation and altitude for the snow model that are important. And then on the right, you see the river routing scheme. So you won't see routed flows today, but the runoff from each grid cell can be assigned to a gauge point, which is the hollow circle in that sort of map diagram with the connected blue circles. That gauge flow, simulated gauge flow, can then be compared with observed gauge flows. But the model also produces lots of other output fields. The linearized approach basically takes the VIC hydrologic model or any other hydrologic model, runs it with a reference case, and then runs it again with perturbation to either the precipitation or the temperature. So the elasticity of precipitation is the flows in the reference case, say -1%, and then compare those flows with the reference case, and that shows how much the flows respond to precipitation. Then you do the same thing with small temperature perturbations, and then you can add those up, and you basically have a poor man's hydrologic model, which you can run thousands of times once you quantify this. So we have a paper that's in preparation, which we're also using this approach with vegetation modeling with John Kim, who's sitting over here, and Julie Vano is in the back, to try this. So this is just an example with the Willamette flow. The scatter diagram is like what you saw before, the changes in temperature and precipitation. These are now for specific seasons. And then the curved lines are derived from the linearized model, where Julie's run the VIC model a bunch of times with these small perturbations. And so we can estimate the response of the Willamette flow to different kinds of climate change. And so this the zero curve shows that if temperature increased 1 degree Celsius and precipitation increased 10%, you get no change in the summer flow in the Willamette. And then if you just go up the y-axis, you got 1 degree Celsius temperature change with no precipitation change. The flow would go down by about 15% in the summer, and that's because of earlier snowmelt. So this is a very quick way of sort of looking at the whole set of climate model results without having to run all of these climate models through the VIC hydrologic model. And so it suggests that if you just look at those contours, that the sort of average result is about a 25% decrease in summer flow, but there are some models that lie pretty close to the zero contour and some that lie close to the 50% contour. So we can now quantify the uncertainties much more efficiently. Okay, getting to the full VIC results, this is a multi-model average. You'll see a lot more of these plots from Dennis later, but I just wanted to highlight. This is the percent change in snow water equivalent for the Pacific Northwest. The simulated historical change on the left, and then percent change for RCP 4.5 in the middle and 8.5 on the right. And all those reds indicate places where the snowpack decreases, and you'll notice the low elevation places decrease the most, and snow's completely gone in a lot of the Oregon Cascades. You see a few spots of blue in the North Cascades and the headwaters of the Columbia. These are places where you actually get more snow in April because of the slight increase in winter precipitation, and then it's so cold that a little warming doesn't hurt things any. And this is sort of mid-century results. Soil moisture, in most of the region, it goes down. There are very slight percentage increases in the Columbia Basin and the Snake River Plain. Basically, places that are extremely dry can retain a little bit more soil moisture in the summer, and Dennis may explain that later. This is an average over the whole domain of the Pacific Northwest for the precipitation. Again, an all-model average, so these are seasonal cycles over the water year, October on the left, September on the right. We have Chinese New Year, we have regular American New Year, and then there's the hydrologic New Year, which is October 1st. I actually have a colleague in Seattle who sends out New Year's cards on October 1st. It's very funny. Anyway, that's why this is October to September. But the precipitation, the black is the historical, and then blue and red is the future for RCP 8.5, two different time periods, mid-century and late century. So you see the precipitation goes up a bit in the winter, and then the dashed curves are the runoff. Black is 20th century, and then blue and red stepping forward into the future. So you see the average runoff over the region goes up in all of the winter months and early spring, and then it starts going down and goes down quite profoundly in June, July, and August. So this change in snowmelt-driven hydrology is pretty significant. This is an average over all the models of the regional snow water equivalent, and so you see a slight decline in the 20th century simulations in black, and then continuing and beginning to see a separation between 4.5 and 8.5 in the second part of the century. 4.5 reaches a decline of almost 50%, and 8.5 more than 50% by the end of the century. So the hydrologic summary, these are preliminary results. We're still cranking out runs. The sensitivity approach suggests that the Willamette flow would decrease about 25% as a best guess, but with an uncertainty range of about 25%. Snow decreases roughly 50%, a little more if we go high emissions, a little less with low emissions. Late summer soil moisture decreases almost everywhere. More simulations on the way. Moving briskly to the vegetation. MC2 is a dynamic general vegetation model. It has 3 modules simulating biogeography, biogeochemistry, and wildfire. Plant types are distinguished by evergreen or deciduous, so it's not simulating hundreds of species. These are main plant types. The main thing that determines the dominance of the life forms is the temperature in the coldest month and the growing season precipitation. Domain is western U.S. 3PG is a forest physiology model, somewhat different approach. Some of the outputs are the same, but it's used to predict species presence or absence. Again, the domain is western U.S. We've aggregated the results over ecoregions as shown here. This is a convenient way to understand changes in similar ecoregions. These are aggregate results for the total ecosystem carbon. In each panel, the top curve is the this is total ecosystem carbon. I was going to say above ground and below ground, but so if you just look at the general directions of those curves, almost everywhere the ecosystem carbon goes up, but the top left, the maritime west coast forest, you can see actually goes down somewhat, and we'll come back to that. So this is the vegetation carbon, not the total ecosystem carbon. This is the above ground vegetation carbon for the averaged over the whole northwestern U.S., and it's showing the traces for all the models, and this is RCP 8.5. So each of the GCMs has been run through MC2 to produce this, and you see a gradual decline followed by a little bit of an increase. That's much more pronounced if we look at the Willamette Valley, where there's about a 20% decrease in ecosystem carbon. And the reason for that is that all of the climate simulations, every single one, has at some point a large fire year in the Willamette Valley. You see all those spikes are years when that model had a big fire, and so the fraction on the left, the y-axis, is the fraction of the Willamette Valley ecoregion that burned. And by about 2060, whatever's going to burn has burned. There's been a transformation of the vegetation, and the fire regime goes quiescent, and the ecosystem carbon starts to rebuild. Our colleagues Dominique and Tim, who you'll hear from later, have built this really cool tool where you can go play around with the different ecoregions. And so I'm just going to show you a few results here. This is for the full area, so you can select the climate variables you want to see and also the vegetation variables. And then it produces, I think Dominique said there are 8,800 panels. So that you can look at. So this is all at the website at the bottom, which you have in your handout. So just the whole area, the dark green is forest. You'll see larger versions of these in a moment, but for the whole region, the fraction of forest goes up slightly, and the fraction of the woodland, which is the light green, goes down a little bit, and the shrubland also goes down a little bit. So this is the full area panel that I just showed you. Upper right-hand corner is the map of what we mean by full area. And then we're going to go through and highlight different ecoregions. So the northern basin and range is that kind of tan area at the bottom of southeastern Oregon and southern Idaho. Big decrease in the shrubland and increase in woodland toward the end of the century. I'm just going to skip quickly through the results. Northern basin and range, this is the historical simulation, and then going into the future with the MIROC 5 model. This is the Puget Lowlands. starting out all forest, and then fraction of area burned is across the bottom, and you can see this is for the HADGEM2 model, but virtually all the models show something like this. You get a big fire, and it reduces the forest and brings in woodland and shrubland, and then it reverts to all forest. This is just a different version of the HADGEM model where the fires happen a little bit earlier, but pretty much the same story. The 3PG model, this is an example, again, with the MIROC 5 model, and the top left is the net primary productivity for the 1990s, top right is for the 2090s, and then the bottom is the difference. And so in most of the West, the net primary productivity goes down pretty substantially, but it goes up. You can see the light blue coloring in the Cascades and the Olympics. So the west slopes of the Cascades do see an increase in NPP. So summary of the vegetation: west-wide increases in stored carbon and net primary productivity for RCP 8.5. The burned area increases and then decreases, and most of this is happening in the wet forests west of the Cascades. In these areas, virtually all of the climate scenarios say the same thing, that there will be an increase in fires in the sort of middle third or so of the 21st century, vegetation transition and lower stored carbon. There's the website for the vegetation modeling. So overall summary: warming is happening. Precipitation changes are uncertain. We see important shifts in snowmelt-driven hydrology, wholesale changes in vegetation type, and fire risk in certain areas. Thank you, and take a couple of questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, and can you step to the mic so that folks on the, and we have a roving mic as well.
Thanks, Phil. Lori Hennings. The last slide that you showed, I'm sorry, one after that. So that's for the entire West in the Pacific Northwest?
That's for the Western U.S. And if you're going to ask a detailed question, I'm going to have to put Dominique.
It was going to be a Willamette Valley trend question.
Okay, so let's look at the. Okay.
That's fine.
We can save all the questions for the
Just a
people who
quick
really
question
know
here. Phil Pasteris with CH2M Hill. I noticed the differing baselines for all the delta calculations for the different parameters, and one of the things that is always a challenge to working with the client is, okay, which baseline should we use? And is it the AR5 baselines? I see the 1950 to 1999. So are you at least thinking about addressing some of the standardization of the baselines when you do your modeling and other things?
That's a great question, and we have not really talked about that as a team. For some purposes, we've used 30-year time slices in the future, and so sometimes we use a 30-year time slice in the past just for consistency. But yeah, we should talk about that. Thanks, Phil. That'd be a fairly easy thing to standardize across all the modeling, but part of that also depends on, what time slices people are most interested in. Do you want a mid-century and an end of century, or do you want 30 years in the middle and 30 years at the end, or do you just want 50 in the middle, or whatever? And there may be 20 different answers to that, but.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that comment about having a standardized baseline. As a land manager, it gets really tough to figure out how to talk about these things when the baseline keeps moving and changing and whatnot, and you don't know how to compare results done in a past analysis to results done in a current analysis because the baseline changes.
There's a question from John Mankowski. How can these summaries and scenarios be accessed by the public, LCCs, managers, etc.? The North Pacific LCC would like to explore hosting some of these data on its conservation planning atlas on Databasin.
So the primary destination under contract with USGS for these data is the Northwest Knowledge Network at University of Idaho. And so the MACA results already reside there. We're uploading everything else there. If somebody wants to mirror that, that's fine. There may be some issues with having versions of data, different versions of data in different places. So we also have the vegetation data at the conservation biology site, and that's also part of our contract. And then the user interface is a pretty important part of that. So simply having the data reside somewhere else is largely a matter of making sure that we have good version control, but the web portals, I think, are pretty important.
And I just wanted to add one thing.
This is Dominique Bachelet, one of our team members.
We are putting together the site in database with all the results that you can show within the NPLCC webpage. So the Conservation Atlas will have direct access to the summary graphics that we've produced about this particular project.
Great, thanks. All right, I think we better move on to David Roop's talk. He's going to give more detail on the climate story.